Welcome inmates, today is a special video as we get into the 13th week of 9.1 because we have to talk about the nerfs that happened to the raid. As you know, the Hall of Fame has been closed for the Horde for quite a few weeks, and just last week the Hall of Fame for Alliance was closed. So congratulations, a round of applause for the Alliance to get to Hall of Fame, but what this means once the Hall of Fame gets closed for both factions is that balance tuning is going to reign in on the raid. Now, sometimes this is the only time we get the balance tuning of the bosses, but other times we also have gotten some balance tuning a few weeks into the progression, shortly after the World First race ended. So before getting a couple of months gap before the Hall of Fames were closed, we will get some more balance tuning. This time we got much less. We got much more scars of a nerfing, mostly. Now we have gotten a whole bunch. Now this raid, as I praised it before, is pretty balanced. It is pretty well tuned for most of the bosses, and you know, there were some outliers which were also difficult to balance, like Painsmith, because the main difficulty of Painsmith is essentially, you know, a minigame. You know, it's hard to nerf Painsmith when you have to dodge around and run around, which is even difficult to put in perspective of being a WoW encounter. Is more like a minigame, really. And outside of Painsmith, most of the other bosses are pretty nicely tuned and designed. You did have two main complaints outside of Painsmith. Number one, Kel'Thuzad has developed to have a pretty wonky strategy, and Sylvanas is way too long. So what did we get for nerfs in this change? Which is going live with the Realm restarts, so pretty much today is going to be live for the NA reset, and then tomorrow is going to be live for the EU reset. There are two nerfs for Painsmith, but only really one is what matters. The first one, the less important one, is that Shadow Steel Chains periodic damage reduced by 15% in Mythic difficulty. Now, this is a pretty okay change. You know, the Shadow Steel Chains are like the sixth source of damage you're going to be taking. It's not that important. It's just very risky when players have the chains, and on top of that, they are taking the damage from the traps and they're taking the damage from the weapons being thrown. You have to keep an eye out for the people with the chains because they are going to go very low. So that's what's helping you with this nerf. But the real important nerf is the other one. The really important change is the other one, which is the one that reduces the distance between floor spike gaps during the intermission of Painsmith. The description from the developer's note is that the distance between the safe locations should now be more consistent with this change. So my assumption is that basically you're no longer going to have these tracks in the intermission, for example, where you are all the way towards the right, and then the next safe spot is all the way to the left, right? So you're going to have them closer to the middle. I think the idea with this change in general is that you're going to be able to put down a Windrush totem in the middle of the room, and you will always be able to move left with the Windrush buff and then go back to the middle with the buff still active, still in range for the totem to go to the left, to go to the right, and then back to the left, and then back to the right, without these gaps being too far apart from each other, which is going to be a good help for the slow specs, right? The slow movement ones. So this is just about one of the main helps you could have gotten from Painsmith, because the intermission is definitely the harder part of the progression, at the very least. Learning the encounter, that's always the one that's going to cause you the most wipes. Then we have also gotten some changes in Fatescribe, although Fatescribe, this is just for normal and heroic difficulties. Updated the rune locations to be more consistent with clockwise rotations and slightly less demanding with counterclockwise rotations, but this is just for normal and heroic. The same goes for the timer, the leniency in the timer. Players now have 10 more seconds in Raid Finder difficulty, 10 more seconds in normal, and then 5 more seconds in heroic to be able to realign the runes to their sockets. It doesn't touch Mythic, but, you know, the whole minigame was always the tougher part of Fatescribe as well, especially when it comes to PAGs with very little communication, so this is going to help it even more. Now we go, however, to the main course of the changes, which are the last two bosses, Kel'Thuzad and Sylvanas. So for those who haven't gotten to Kel'Thuzad or haven't really paid attention as to why the strategy of Kel'Thuzad is being played that way, the strategy of Kel'Thuzad is being played that way because he has an ability called Glacial Wrath. Glacial Wrath is what spawns the glacial spikes. These spikes are going to be doing so much damage that the way you want to deal with them is to simply pop them all at once by using all of your healer cooldowns, including Darkness, including Rallying Cry, your Barrier, your Spirit Link, Healing Tide Totem, everything you have. Because you are able, with the way the encounter works right now, you are able to wait. You are able to wait enough time that once you bring Kel'Thuzad to no HP and he enters the intermission, by the time he comes back, all of your 2 and 3 minute cooldowns for the healers are going to be back up. So when the spikes spawn again, you can do the same thing. You can pop all of the cooldowns to survive. This created, however, a pretty annoying situation. An annoying situation where you had a very long amount of waiting time, of not really much to do, because you had to wait for the timer to have gone by at least a long enough amount to guarantee your cooldowns to come back, which is kind of boring, right? So Blizzard is trying to change the way all of this functions now. Now, with the realm restarts, Kel'Thuzad health is going to be reduced by 5%. The remnant of Kel'Thuzad, so the guy in the phylactery, health has been reduced by 20%. The Unstoppable, Abomination, and the Soul Reaver, so the two adds you have to deal with, the two type of adds you have to deal with in the intermission, their health has also been reduced by 20% in Mythic difficulty. And then the Frozen Destruction's initial damage, which is the damage generated by the spikes being broken, the initial damage is reduced by 40%, and the damage over time effect has been reduced by 10%, and the duration is reduced to 8 seconds when it was 10. So on top of that, it's going to take 1 time less. Also, there's going to be a fix where Kel'Thuzad is no longer going to cast other abilities during Howling Blast in Mythic difficulty, and also Howling Blizzard now is going to inflict stacking damage over the duration of the channel on Mythic difficulty. Now, again, for those who are not aware, Howling Blizzard is what Kel'Thuzad would passively start channeling as soon as you depleted his mana. That is usually the situation you bring him in when you start waiting. So Blizzard is trying to stop you from waiting by making this Howling Blizzard do ticking, stacking damage, growing harder and harder to heal over time. So essentially, they want you to kill Kel'Thuzad. They want you to make the transition in the Kel'Thuzad intermission phase to be faster. And in fact, in their developers' notes, they're saying the changes that we have settled for aim at making it impossible to stall indefinitely. Otherwise, you're gonna get killed by the stacking damage of Howling Blizzard, and while reducing the difficulty of key elements of the encounter to make it no longer feel required to have this entire stalling phase. So the idea now is that you will be able to push Kel'Thuzad. You will be able, for example, to try to do the push at the start without getting to having to wait for healer cooldowns, because the damage of the Frozen Destruction from the spikes is so much lower that you will perhaps be able to now start dividing healing cooldowns. For example, half of the cooldowns go in the first spikes, the other half go in the second spikes, and then the cooldowns you used the first time are going to be back for the third and last spikes. The assigning of DPS cooldowns is also much less relevant and much less needed now, because the Phylactery Kel'Thuzad, the remnant of Kel'Thuzad in the Phylactery, also has 20% less HP. So it's going to be much less needed to carefully plan your boomkins, your Ventir boomkins, to have their cooldowns to go down in the Phylactery, because now the damage is going to be more than enough, even with wonky usage of cooldowns, since the image of Kel'Thuzad is going to have 20% less HP. Lastly, however, we have the nerfs to Sylvanas. Now, Sylvanas in and of itself didn't really need nerfs. She was a very balanced fight. It's a very nice, it's a very smooth fight. There is only a problem in all this smoothness of difficulty, which is very long, okay? The fight itself is way too long. So unfortunately, none of these nerfs are going to fix the fact that the fight is too long. So it's gonna continue being roughly 14 minutes long. However, now it's gonna be made easier. Domination arrows HP in the first phase are going to be reduced by 15%. Dark Sentinel's health, the adds HP spawned by the Wedding Arrow, is reduced by 15% HP in Mythic. You have Curse of Lethargy in the second phase, duration reduced to 4 seconds from 6. This is a more of like a fail-safe mistake nerf, because this is something you want to dispel immediately. You want to decurse this immediately. So basically, instead of being angry because it wasn't dispelled for 6 seconds. Now it's gonna be just 4 seconds, but it's still kind of bad to let it run for so long. The Decrepit Orb detonation damage has been reduced by 10% in Mythic difficulty in the second phase, as well as the Veil of Darkness size being reduced from 15 to 12 yards in the second phase. And then you have the nerfs to the last phase. Banshee's Fury, unavoidable damage reduced by 15% on Mythic difficulty, and then Ranger's Heartseeker, Banshee's Heartseeker, and Banshee's Blades damage reduced by 8% on Mythic difficulty. So you have a set of changes to make pretty much all of the phases more easy and more bearable. Some of them running throughout the encounter, like basically Sylvanas' version of auto attacks, her combo, her Heartseeker combos. As I said, most of the players would have been happier to have a nerf that somehow cut the fight from a 14-minute fight to an 11-minute fight, for example, but these are still certainly going to help. The harder phase, progression-wise, the harder phase is going to be phase 1. So looking at the phase 1 wipes, looking at the phase 1 difficulties, so to speak, being able to deal with the adds a little bit faster is going to be good, particularly by the end of the phase, as well as the domination arrows being easier to take down are probably two of the more important changes you could have gotten in phase 1. Also, the fact that Sylvanas is gonna slam the tanks a little bit less in phase 1 because her combos getting nerfed by 8% is also okay. The main nerfs in phase 2 are also pretty strong. These nerfs are pretty much all on the right side for the guys who have to deal with the Summoner Soul Judge combo and having the curses running out at the same time of the orbs running out. It's a pretty hectic phase and most of this stuff is getting nerfed. The Veil of Darkness range was also pretty tricky because you are on a bridge, and pretty much the size of the Veil of Darkness was covering the entirety, almost the entirety of the bridge. So now, even though 3 yards looks like it's very tiny of a change, it's actually going to make it much more easier to be able to find that little spot at the side of the bridge that doesn't get clipped by Veil of Darkness, so it's definitely gonna make it easier. Same goes for Banshee's Fury. Banshee's Fury was one of those types of abilities which is what makes shamans and discipline priests and holy paladins so good in this type of fight, because it's a lot of damage and you want damage reduction for that type of ability. So getting nerfed by 15% is also gonna do well, particularly for groups that don't have that many disposable strong cooldowns. Maybe a guild running with a Mistweaver Monk and a Resto Druid, or a guild running with double Holy Priest or something like that. This is gonna go much more easy on them in terms of healing cooldowns. So, as expected, we are getting these changes at the end of the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame getting closed. Now we get our raid changes. Pretty interesting changes, but as I said, it's kind of wonky because one of the main complaints were different this time. We are used to having complaints about bosses being too hard or too complex or too wonky, like for example Stone Legion in Castelnatria, whereas this time around the complaints were a little bit more unique and exotic. Like, main complaint during Painsmith was that weird intermission you had to deal with. The complaints on Kel'Thuzad was that the waiting time was too long, and the complaint on Sylvanas was that the duration was too long. So it's kind of hard to nerf these type of complaints, you know, to try to make them easier, to try to please these complaints, because they are not fixed in the usual way. When you usually complain about a boss, you know, the solution isn't just to go like, hey, okay, let's just nerf this boss's damage by 20% and the complaint is gone. These type of bosses require a little bit more tinkering with mechanics and with timings, etc., to make them not as frustrating. So I think the change to Painsmith should be fine. The changes into the gaps to make them easier to reach should be a fine change for the intermission, which is the main problem of Painsmith. The changes to KT, they look very confusing because you're basically going to be changing the way you play the fight almost completely, since you're not going to be waiting anymore. So it is likely that for the first time you go back to KT, you're actually going to wipe even more because of this change. You're going to get even more confused, but after you get used to it, then it's going to be easier. As far as Sylvanas, however, your 14-minute fight is still going to be there. It's not going to take you that long, but it has definitely gotten easier now. So basically you're going to have less chances to wipe during this 14-minute fight due to most of the more dangerous abilities getting nerfed in damage. So it should make it more manageable now for the guilds still chasing cutting edge. Now, with this list of changes, we can stop for the day. After all, this is the start of autumn, so we can't go too long making videos. As you know, it's the rule. Thank you guys anyways for watching the video. Let me guys know if you're currently progressing on any of these bosses. I've already heard some people being slightly disappointed, actually. You know, some people were getting close to, for example, killing KT or getting close to killing Sylvanas, and they would have liked, you know, to be able to kill the boss pre-nerf, especially the ones close to killing KT, who now have to basically learn an entire different mechanic and an entire different strategy compared to what they were trying to get before this nerf. So let me know then if any of you were in this situation, and for the moment we can stop here. Again, thanks for watching the video. If you've enjoyed the channel and this type of content, you can leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe to this channel, to my kids' channel and my ex-wife's channel as well. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, finally the cold has come. I even pulled out my long pants and fluffy socks just to be ready.